Hello, I'm Andrew Mazzone, president of the Henry George School of Social Science. Welcome to Smart Talk. On this program, we will discuss controversial topics with leading economists from around the world. We think you will find them timely and compelling. Today's guest, who is joining us via Skype, is Ed Nell. Nell is the former professor of the New School of Social Research, where he was the Malcolm B. Smith Professor of Economics. He is currently the chief economist for Recipco. Professor Nell is a world-renowned economic theorist whose latest book is The General Theory of Transformational Growth. He argues for a historical perspective to explain how innovation determines economic development. Professor Nell, welcome to Smart Talk. Well, Professor Nell, thanks for joining our series. Of course, we're Georgists. You know, we're a small, marginalized sector of economics that 100 years ago was pretty powerful. We hope by looking at our views in terms of just taxing monopoly, we can generalize the Georgist paradigm, and therefore we're reaching out to everybody that can engage us in intelligent discussions on economics. Now, we wanted you, along with one other economist in this world, Luigi Passanetti. We consider you, both of you, the economists' economists. And in terms of structure and theory and the extent of your writings, we think it's just fabulous. So what we're going to ask you to do, is we're going to pick up the world in the manorial economy of the pre-Middle Ages and walk through the transformations that occurred till we finally got here. We have enough time. And we're going to keep in mind your idea of the golden rule and the balance of the economy and why things balance both monetarily and in real terms and why they change and transform. Why don't we pick up the manorial economy, where it's kind of a steady state structure, there's a balance, it's a closed system, and things are doing just fine. And maybe you could describe the manorial economy and then why it started to change and migrate toward what we saw as a mercantilist, capitalist economy, and then we'll take it all the way up until globalization.
Well, I think there are several different but interlocking reasons. The manorial economy was quite an interesting system. It supported both the peasantry that did all of the work and the nobility, which provided, in a sense, government. It provided protection. It was a military system, and it provided protection, and it provided a form of justice, somewhat rudimentary, but again, the church intervened to perhaps make the justice a little bit softer and fairer. But the manorial economy divided the land between the peasantry, who worked their own plots, and the domain land, which they worked for the lords. And of course, that was the support for the workers and the surplus, which went to the nobility and the military and the church. So you had a very obvious system of surplus production. The support for the peasantry was their land. The support for the nobility was and all the rest was the domain land, and the crops were approximately divided in the same proportion. This system was a stable one so long as there wasn't a climate disaster or some kind of plague. Towns were very small, and the towns, of course, had to be supported by the surplus from the countryside. But the towns also developed crafts. And as we go from the 11th to the 12th century to the 13th century, we find that the crafts become more and more sophisticated. I'm, of course, talking about Europe, Western Europe. And as they become more sophisticated, They also enable agriculture to become more productive. And of course, new crops are being introduced. This is the time when beans are introduced, and they really increase the protein of the population. People get healthier and live longer. But they also produce a larger surplus, which permits the support of larger towns. And with the support of larger towns, you get much greater concentration of craftsmen in locations where they interact. And this develops the technology. Military technology develops, but along with it, the making of tools. In the making of tools, the making of leather and saddles and all of the kinds of things for horses and horse-drawn carriages, making of wheels much better so that you are able to cart longer distance, and of course also the making of ships.
How would the system balance out financially? How would it recirculate the surpluses from the town to the country at that point?
Well, from what you would have is the peasantry would either work the corvée, as it was called, that is, they would work their labor on the land, or in other cases, the peasantry would pay a rent. They would work all forms of land, and they would have the crop, and they would deliver a portion of the crop to the nobility, who would spend it in the towns on the products of the craftsmen of the towns.
Would they use money, or would it be a trade in kind?
Well, money is interesting. Money develops in the feudal system, but it develops late and it doesn't develop very far. Money is mostly used in international trade. The trade of northern Italy, for example, spread out across the Mediterranean. And the craft economies of Pisa and Siena and Florence and Venice and even Milan traded with the Far East, with the Near East, and with North Africa, and with Spain. But the trade was monetized, but the trade between town and countryside was a kind of quasi-barter. It was barter mediated by an accounting system in which there were periodic clearances, and the clearances were often carried out by money.
The technology that you describe, essentially a surplus of agricultural products, spontaneously developed or transformed the towns into higher and better technology, or is that just some spontaneous development, unexplainable, or?
Well, I think it's explainable by the fact that you had craftsmen concentrating in an area, and when they produced high quality goods, those entered into international trade, which brought them into contact with other cultures where they learned technology. There was technological exchange. Much of the work in Italy and in France and in Germany along the Rhine was ironwork. But in Toledo in Spain and in Damascus at the other end of the Mediterranean, really high quality steel was being produced. And that really mattered to the nobility, who needed that for their armor and their weaponry. So military efforts also pushed the trade, and of course the Crusades brought the military of Europe into contact with the whole of the Near East. And that also formulated a lot of trade.
What would have disrupted the manorial economy with the trade and everything? What would be a jolt? A jolt? Would it have been the discoveries in the New World, the influx of tremendous amounts of gold and resources?
The initial shock was the Black Death, 1348 to 1352, which more or less took a quarter or possibly even more of the population of Western Europe. And that shock created a tremendous amount of exchange of property through inheritance. And it led to the redevelopment of the system because there was a tremendous labor shortage. And in that period, there was a tremendous rise in the real wages and real standard of living of the lowest part of the population. It is argued by some that the standard of living that was reached around 1500 was not reached again until almost 1900. The standard of living of the working class, of the free peasants and the craftsmen, rose to a really phenomenal height in the half century after the Black Death. And this was partly due to the shortage of labor. It was also partly due to the vastly increased level of skills. In a sense, the Black Death broke apart a lot of the monopoly practices among the craftsmen of the towns. And this provided a much freer flow of information and a development of the craft economies. Then, of course, the discovery of the New World and the importation of a huge amount of gold and silver, which led to a great increase in the use of money and a shift of rents from being delivered in real terms to being delivered in monetary terms. And this changed the character of the feudal system. It was no longer a system of obligations. It was now a system of property and rents.
Okay, this is basically an English development for the most part, would you say?
Well, the interesting thing is that as the system of mercantilism develops, it is perhaps as much French as English, French and Dutch as much as English. There is a tremendous trade with the Far East, and a feature of this trade is that the ratio of value of gold and silver is different in the Far East than it is in Western Europe. The thing is, it becomes very advantageous to ship silver to the Far East and trade it for gold. Now, this is a trade that has no real economic significance, if you see what I mean. But you make a profit. This leads to one of the first great exploitations of Ireland by England. England sets the relative price of gold and silver in London in such a way that it is very advantageous to take silver out of Ireland. And it leaves the Irish economy with no monetary system. And many, many writers in Dublin complain about this, and they blame Sir Isaac Newton, who was the master of the mint at this point. We very seldom think of Newton as an economist, let alone as a practical economist, but he set the relative price of gold and silver at the mint in London, and he set it in such a way as to attract gold to England. And it attracted silver in order to ship it to the Far East and bring back gold. In effect, this put England on, in practice, a gold standard in the early part of the 18th century. And this proved very advantageous to England.
To the point where they would prefer to have a gold surplus more than a product surplus or anything else.
It enabled the development of the Bank of England, I should say. It made the Bank of England the dominant bank and it made it the banker's bank.
How did that help English industry and development? And what happened to England during this period as far as switching from a manorial to kind of an industrial economy?
Well, of course, there were the great innovations, the development of steam power and the development of the Navy and the development of foundries that were able to make military cannons, guns, muskets, and so on. But most of all, I think it was the ability of steam power to pump. It made coal mining possible on a scale that was unlike any other country, and it gave England a source of energy that really made industrialization possible.
What would be the causation, just in that point alone, which is a key point, lots of argument. How did the line of causation run to the industrialization, the steam and coal? What engendered that, or is it just serendipity?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And I think a large part of the answer is the very early movement and very large movement in England of labor off the land into the cities, and particularly into London, but also into other cities. This initially occurred in Norfolk when, as the phrase went, sheep ate men. The enclosure movement began in Norfolk, driving the peasantry off the land in order to make room for grazing huge flocks of sheep, the wool being then shipped to Holland for carding, weaving, and so on. And then gradually weaving began to take place in England, and large centers of weaving, and also a lot of cottage industry where you had a kind of contracting out of small scale weaving. But the English formed the factory system, and then the development of the power loom put them ahead of everybody else.
And by order of magnitude, how great did that power surge, steam surge, impact England relative to the rest of the world? Obviously, they ended up conquering the world, but if you looked at it from an economic point of view, just how much of an advantage did that steam power give English industry?
It in 30 to 40 years, they went from a prominent textile manufacturer handling pretty much of their own requirements to being the dominant textile manufacturing area of the world, including putting India out of business.
Let's cut to an economist, Adam Smith at the time. He kind of synthesizes economic development, but he doesn't really catch the surge of steam and so forth in his book, his classic book, The Wealth of Nations.
He doesn't comment on it, as you say, and it's quite interesting because he is very observant in regard to economies of scale. And his famous example of the pin factory is a really excellent account of the division of labor, the importance of scale, the importance of the market, because the larger the market, the greater the scale on which you can operate. And it's immensely cheaper to do this. He doesn't, although he is against monopolies, the monopolies that he is against are primarily monopolies that are granted by the state, by royal prerogative. He doesn't discuss the development of private monopolies, which would seem a natural step from his understanding of the economies of scale and how much you benefit from this and how much you can undersell everybody else. So Smith, in a way, the economy that he describes is the economy of 30 or 40 years before the date of publication. And he doesn't really see the factory system either. That once you have a power source and you can develop workstations, although this was already evident with water power. Water wheels could turn through gearing a whole series. You have a turning rod, and then you draw power down from that turning rod to run a wheel at a workstation. This is already developed in the late 18th century. And in the early 19th century, it develops enormously in Massachusetts. But he doesn't see any of this.
Doesn't seem to see any of that. I guess we have to move to Ricardo a little further down the road before you finally have a sense of the economy as some kind of closed system that you can analyze in its detail. Your comments on that?
Certainly Ricardo, but one should also remember the physiocrats, and particularly Francois Quesnay, who have a very neat, although very small, system. They really concentrate on the circulation of goods in the economy by means of money. So the so-called zigzag model that Quesnay develops is analytically superior to anything in Adam Smith.
Absolutely, but of course they see value as only coming from agricultural produce essentially, but they don't recognize value contributed any place else. But they do have a closed system there.
He considers the craft economy as part of the sterile system, which is amazing because the craft economy had already contributed to the increase in the productivity of agriculture a couple of hundred years earlier. It's really surprising that Quesnay should not have appreciated this. But in any case, it takes Ricardo to really give us a full-scale model of the growth of the economy and the changing character of distribution between the working class, the capitalists who employ the workers in the cities, and the capitalist farmers who employ workers on agriculture, and the landlords who collect rent.
How do you rate Ricardo as an economist, basically? I mean, would you say he's the first theorist that, for example, someone like you could get your teeth into and then actually project forward ways to analyze the economy?
I think Ricardo was quite brilliant, and it is the first really sophisticated model. He he sees it. It's analytically very interesting. It's historical. He sees growth as an historical process, and he sees it as a process of changing the changing character of the economy.
Okay, but why wouldn't he have seen increasing returns? Basically, he's sitting also in the Industrial Revolution, where instead of diminishing returns in the system, if he had observed the factory system itself, he would have seen tremendous amounts of cases of increasing returns, basically negating his diminishing returns model. Your comment on that?
Well, I think that increasing returns for Ricardo would have been a stimulus to further investment in the towns and in the factories, which would have drawn more workers in, which would have required more agricultural land. It would have required extending cultivation to poorer and poorer lands, which would have driven up rents.
It's the old Georgist argument right there. But then you could argue industrialization would make intensive cultivation of lands almost infinitely productive, and that diminishing returns would not appear in lands as we've seen in the United States, for example.
There, I think Ricardo's answer was the great lands of North America are so much superior to any lands in England or really in the rest of Europe that it is importing from North America that will keep the price of corn down and keep real wages up so that industrial development can take place.
So why don't you explain to everybody the corn laws?
Passing the corn laws meant it was a big step towards free trade, which meant that England could import all the grain, all the foods, all the agricultural products it needed from America and Canada and pay for them with its industrial products. And the imported agricultural goods were cheap, and so it made considerable profits on its imports versus exports, and at the same time, it stopped the increase of rents.
Okay, of course, the argument, of course, then if we just jump to the United States, developing at the same time, the United States around 1800 becomes free, it has a sense of itself, and says, okay, we understand English and industrial dominance, we understand the free trade argument, but maybe we should put up some tariffs against English imports and have the free trade amongst ourselves, but tariffs against England, and we might be able to get this learning by doing and industrialization really going here. What would the English have understood and as the Americans did that, and why did the Americans understand enough to do that?
American economic policy oscillated between Jefferson and Hamilton for almost a century. The Jeffersonian vision was of a small-scale economy, that is, lots of small farmers and lots of small craftsmen, self-reliant citizens who defended their liberties and who were essentially all the same size, the same scale. So it was equality and liberty based on a very simple economy of agriculture and crafts, into which Hamilton wished to introduce banks who would enable large-scale industry to develop, and large-scale industry would put the small farmers, large-scale agriculture would put the small farmers out of business, large-scale industry would put the small craftsmen out of business. And you would have the development of a corporate economy. He actually uses the term corporate, Jefferson does at some points, because he's pointing to the corporations in Boston and Philadelphia. And Hamilton wants the development of banks in order to fund larger industry, and that is anathema. So you have the Jeffersonian versus Hamilton struggle over whether the American economy is to develop on an industrial basis or to remain on a small-scale farm and craft basis.
Well, Hamilton won the argument, obviously.
Well, the bank was shut down, of course, by Jackson. It took a while. It was Lincoln who really carried the day, and Lincoln was, he funded the railroads, the building of the railroads. He developed the tariff. He really went for large government in a way that was completely opposed to the Jeffersonians, Jefferson-Jackson vision of the American economy. And then, of course, with the Roosevelts, both Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt completely developed this much further, So the American economy really does develop in an industrial and banking system, but many of the things foreseen by Jefferson do actually take place.
What about, then, segueing back to the economists following Ricardo, we come to Marx, who essentially now can see the industrial capitalist system in a complete sense, and he looks at it saying it's essentially one that's going to displace the Ricardian diminishing returns problem with rents, but he's saying essentially capitalism itself is going to run into a realization problem, and essentially because of monopoly power, probably, and so forth, essentially it'll choke itself down because it will never have enough realization based on the way it's structured. And of course, this kind of plays right into your view of transformational growth, things you can do to create demand. All of these things are now coming resident in Marx's view of how the economic system is working. It's now full industrialization. He understands that. He's pessimistic about the fairness of it. And of course, he presages, essentially in a big sense, the marginalists, Keynes, and of course, the Cambridge School, of which you're kind of a member.
The thing that Marx sees is the transformation of agriculture, that as industrial systems and steam energy develop, there is a transformation of agriculture, and there is a shift of population off the land into the cities. And this changes the character of cities, it changes the character of the countryside, it changes the relation between agriculture and industry. And Marx understands this and sees this development as producing crises. And he also thinks that there is a crisis built into the idea of capital. And I think here he is maybe less successful in his analysis, but maybe even more successful in his insight, that capital itself has an inherent problem. And that problem is that it must exploit the worker in order to create profit. But if it exploits the worker too much, it is not going to have much of a market. And therefore, there's going to be a pressure always for further expansion, to find new markets, to find new processes that will help deal with this problem.
Well, of course, it's been argued ever since that his transformation problem, of course, never connected value with price, or it's that market prices somehow couldn't reflect value. I mean, economists ever since that time, from the marginalists on out, have maintained he didn't solve the transformation problem, and you can't connect value with price. Of course, you would argue you can do it, and you have successfully done that in your modeling, which is really interesting. We haven't got there yet, but that's, any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I think that both Marx's model of transformation and his model of the balance between the capital goods sector and the consumer goods sector, I think both of these are, in a sense, embryonic models. What we need to do is understand the underlying principle and then develop it more fully, and try developing it in several different ways to see how we can explore this insight. This is crucial, but it's a much deeper insight, in a sense, than I think any of the other great economists have had. Because as I look at the picture with you in it, everything in that picture is man-made. The frames, the walls, the books, the lights, everything. Everything around me is man-made. As I look out the window, I see trees that were planted. Our world is made, and it is made under capitalist incentives, And as we live in the world, we use it up. So we have to reproduce it. And as we reproduce it, we use up the tools and machinery and energy which we are producing.
In a competitive capital model, it's more likely that would happen because you have many, many centers competing against each other. But what about the case where we go from a competitive capital to kind of a mass production or a model or a big corporate model?
Yeah, that's very good. And it fits in very well with Marx's idea that what he calls the relations of production may become fetters or chains on the forces of production. That is to say that initially, when new relations of production develop, institutions, class relationships, governmental relationships, they may foster and develop the forces of production, but as the forces of production develop and as the relations of production continue, they may become constraining.
Well, it broke in a way toward a monopoly version of capitalism. And that seems to be pretty stable structure until recent times.
Well, yes, I think that if you look at the structure of the large, already multinational corporations of the 1950s and 1960s, you see a corporate structure that seems to be working pretty well in realizing economies of scale and paying high wages and growing relatively fast. And after the 1980s and 90s, you find that the corporate structure is having troubles. It's having to downsize. It's finding it difficult to digest the new technologies. It's taking advantage of globalization, but it's running into problems itself. It's creating a terrible and growing pattern of inequality in the advanced economies, but also a great stagnation. The 30 years, 1980 to 2010, is a period of slow growth and high unemployment. And compare it to 1945 to 1975, much higher growth, much less unemployment. Inflation's about the same in the two periods.
There's nothing inherent in the systems, it would seem to me, that would make this a stagnation period. What would cause that difference between 45 and 70 and 80 and today?
I would tentatively argue that it's the growth of finance capitalism again. That inherent in the concept of capital is in a sense, two forms: capital as a fund or as capital as finance on the one hand, capital as productive equipment and skills in people and institutions. That you have, in a sense, economists call it real capital and financial capital. And ideally, these two should be balanced.
Well, you would argue, as a golden mean steady state system, that interest, profits, and growth should be in harmony, should be equal. And Piketty, of course, says 2 centuries of capitalism say that profits outpace growth. You yourself argue that empirical studies prove the same thing. Yet, in a balanced capitalist system, that is not supposed to occur.
I think that maybe we need to introduce a notion, along with monopoly, of economic power, meaning the power to determine market outcomes, being able to manipulate and move, not necessarily strictly speaking in market relationships, but sort of circumventing them. You buy into your competitors, and then you have a seat on the board and you can determine the policy of your competitors, and you force them to make deals with you. Things of this sort. The growth of banking and finance and the development of trusts really enabled a small, powerful group of leading capitalists to control quite a large part of the economy. But just think of the American economy today. A few thousand corporations account for somewhere around 4/5 of the American economy. Less than half the labor force, but more than 3/4 of output. This is the core of the American economy. And it is financed by just maybe at most a couple of dozen huge financial institutions. There's a great deal of power there, and it is used to make money.
But it's a system that can't perpetuate itself and stay that forever if it runs away from the real output that's underneath it.
That's right. It pays. There's arguably in the corporate system of the immediate post-World War II era, the economy had a kind of balance presided over by government.
Let's talk about some of your theoretical work, in juxtaposition with what we've just talked about in finance. Your modeling work, any comments on that relative to the problem we just talked about, the social problem of too much power? Or is modeling just not robust enough to keep up with essentially extraordinary power relations?
Well, I think that modeling hasn't been devoted to power relations. I think it hasn't been devoted adequately. And that's part of the reason we haven't got very far with that. But I would suggest that we should look at a central stylized fact of the American economy as reproduced in other economies as well, the German, the French, the British. In or around 1980, productivity continued to grow on a trend line, an upward line. Now, there are problems with measuring productivity growth.
But it's fair, that's clear. It's clear to us that that's the case. And labor remuneration stayed the same.
So you have a real disconnect there. And the question is, how can the system realize that potential? And in a sense, I think two answers developed, and they both involved the financial sector. Answer number one is mergers and acquisitions. It's very hard for a firm that has productivity gains to start firing its workers. All you're doing is reducing your costs, which is fine, but you haven't taken advantage of the fact that you now have additional capacity.
And where's the additional purchasing power coming from if everybody does this?
Yeah, exactly. And the answer becomes your house is becoming more valuable, and you can take out more value from your
We Georges
house.
would circumvent that by taxing the land value increase. Now what would you do?
Yeah.
Now you couldn't do that.
In 2006, about 7 to 7.5% of consumption demand was financed by mortgages, directly or indirectly, according to a couple of studies by some, I think, very good economists. So the financial sector participates in efforts to realize this, and it also makes itself very agreeable to corporate officers by helping to finance buybacks, which keep the value of their options up.
So this is not a perpetual motion machine. You can't do this forever.
Well, it turned out that that was absolutely true, but they clearly thought that you could do this for a very long time.
Well, if you were them, you could make a lot of money and put it in your pocket and buy farmland and save it, and you're out of harm's way, even if the system collapses. So for a certain group of people, this is a smart set of behaviors, especially if nobody's watching the store.
Yes, exactly. I think this is true. And I think that the important thing at this point is to look at the way in which the financial sector impinges on the real economy, the way it supports it, the way it constrains it, the way it enables it to move, and the direction in which it pushes it. Because it would seem to me that most of this is very dangerous, and it is a danger that is inherent in the idea of the modern financial system. The idea of the modern financial system is we can manage risk. We have the techniques and the equations that enable us to hedge risk. And of course, we need to hedge our hedges too, but we can do that. So the financial system is saying you can take on additional risk. You can move in that direction. Additional risk will bring you higher returns. And we can hedge it adequately so that it's safe.
Assuming the market, for people who will participate in that market, will grow ever bigger. And that can't happen.
Well, I think it's even worse than that. It's assuming that our models, which are based on assumptions about the distribution of probabilities, are accurate. And it's assuming that an abstract distribution of probabilities can play out in real time.
What is your view of where we stand with the economic structure that we have today, the distribution of wealth being so one-sided? What is your view as to a solution?
Okay, I think one important thing is to look at the technologies on the horizon. I completely disagree with Robert Gordon on this.
He says no growth, right?
I think that's completely wrong. I think the new technologies are fantastic. They promise everything from lengthening of the human lifespan to vastly improved transportation, to even further advances in communications, to all kinds of amazing possibilities. But first, all of these technologies have large externalities. If we operate with the idea of limited government, we're not going to be able to realize these. These are technologies that are going to have to be realized in private-public partnerships.
Do you see any possibility of this kind of agenda taking hold?
Well, I think, first of all, it's only gradually becoming apparent that the technological possibilities are as dramatic as I think they are. And secondly, there is a substantial movement in among younger voters and among, broadly speaking, the progressive parts of the Democratic Party to raise the minimum wage quite a lot. That would be a step in the right direction. And I think there's another thing is happening, and that is that
to localization of some sort?
To bringing industries back. There's a little bit of a movement there. I don't know if it's enough to really make a difference, but I think it's clear that it's not the answer to move to China or Philippines.
Thank you so much for joining us here. I mean, you're a great legend and a great resource, and I hope you're having fun up in Woodstock. And that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. In upcoming shows, we will be talking to such renowned economists as Anwar Shaikh, a professor of economics at the graduate faculty of the New School. His work in political economy focuses on U.S. macroeconomic policy, inequality in the world scale, and past and current global economic crises. We will also talk with James Ricardos. He is an American lawyer, economist, and investment banker, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Currency Wars, The Making of the Next Global Crisis. Please post your questions or comments on our website at www.henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzone. We will see you again next time.